Well, to help us unpack National Treasury's social relief measures, we're now joined via Zoom by Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Western Cape's School of Governance. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Prof. Your initial thoughts from what you heard from Treasury today?
Well, thanks very much for having me, Peter. Look, it's a small stimulus and it's a small boost to stressed wallets. I think those are the two critical questions. Will this get the economy going after this terrible shock to the system, which could result in a 1% decline in GDP beyond what we were expecting? And if you recall, last year, around this time, we were hearing 500 billion rand stimulus. It turned out that too much was hoped for the 200 billion rand loans from the loan guarantee. The banks weren't lending. So in fact, when you look at the sort of funded amounts that had just been reprioritized, last year's stimulus was only about 100 billion, about a fifth of what was promised. And now we're only looking at about, well, when you think of, again, redistributing funds already in process, probably closer to 33 billion. But the second point, which is what does it mean for your ordinary person who's, if you're unemployed, roughly 7 million people, plus you're a child support grant caregiver, which is a new element. Now you get the 350 rand a month, at least through March. Is this potentially the route towards a basic income grant, which would stimulate local economies, because it's mostly on food and essentials, and very few of those are going to be leaking out in the way of imports. And then will it also, the critical question that probably motivates all of this, will it slow the anger, frustration, alienation, and social turmoil that we saw so clearly in KZN and Gauteng? Will this be the sort of salve on this terrible wound in society of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment? That remains to be seen.
All right, you've said quite a lot there, and we'll unpack some of them bit by bit. Perhaps at the beginning of it, especially when you compared the funds that were pledged the last time and compared to this time, will enough people be helped, do you think?
Well, not in my view. I mean, the basic income grant idea is that everybody, even a middle-class academic like myself, should get that basic amount, and then you would claw it back and then some from higher taxes. And you could have higher taxes. We had a 27% corporate tax rate this year, but late apartheid 1992, it was about 51%, 52%. So we could go up higher. We could go up higher on the wealthy. I mean, frankly, in the world's most unequal country, there really isn't enough redistribution through the fiscus, through higher taxes. We could also be printing money. There's a standard technique, quantitative easing, to stimulate economies. So in all those respects, I think we could have more people getting grants and higher grants. The 350 really is about a fifth of what the 50 rand a day poverty line is, the upper bound poverty line if you adjust it, if you do it properly. University of Cape Town suggests not 1,268, but closer to 1,500 rand, the researchers at the South African Labour Development Research Unit. So I think what we're really looking at is whether there's enough social pressure from organized advocates. You know, you have very strong social movements and a basic income grant campaign and trade unions. And, you know, they worked hard, but they didn't get very far. And now we've come back. And I think we have to be frank. It's because President Ramaphosa, he might have a theory about an insurrection, about a conspiracy, a coup attempt from a radical economic transformation group. But I think he actually does know in the heart of hearts, or as the defense minister, Mapisa Nhlakula, said, to be honest, this is about the deep poverty and frustration and alienation. And I think throwing a little money at that is a good idea. It's overdue, and we're probably going to need a lot more.
All right, so when we look at developed nations, you know, quantitative easing is standard, and these huge support packages for civilians and businesses come almost as standard, and they've got tons of cash to do it. We have to do something here in South Africa, and a lot of people are going to benefit, but what might be the consequences for so much social spending?
It's still not that much. In fact, if you look at the top 50 economies the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, plus other countries like South Africa, we're actually about third from the bottom in social spending to GDP. Only China, India, and Mexico are below us. So in the major peer countries, in the richer countries, we're actually very low, around about 8%. I mean, Brazil is 15, Russia is 15. So I think we could do a lot more. The political will has to be coming from a more generous Treasury and Reserve Bank than we currently have. Now, as I said, I have a sort of sense that President Ramaphosa is doing this in part because this was about not an insurrection, but a terribly, a cry of the heart from people who were desperate, and they found this opportunistic way to go and loot. And it may be that throwing 350 rand at this massive unemployed youth rate over 60%, the overall unemployment rate when you include people who've given up looking at about 43%, this is something that needs state intervention. Someone like a John Maynard Keynes, that was the great British economist in the 1930s, he would recognize this well. He'd say, look, the private sector here is failing. There's no jobs, very little fixed investment, a lot of nervousness. The real money is in the stock market until, well, Naspers has just crashed, but that's where the big money is. Instead of going into the real economy, to Main Street, we're in a sort of a Sandton Street, Wall Street. And that phenomenon requires the state to be even more active. Every economist will tell you that if you want to save capitalism, you have to recognize when it's down and out, and then you need to push in money. And that was exactly what you said, Peter. Around the world, in the last 12, 15 months or so, that realization that we're in that stage, that capitalism desperately needs these artificial stimulants, fiscal stimulus of social grants or payments to every citizen in the country, or keeping employment up. Or in the case of monetary policy, the Reserve Bank, throwing money at the problem. You can do that. We don't have any inflation threat. It's a new theory, modern monetary theory, that says if it's done properly and it really does go to the base, maybe you can really stimulate the economy. You won't just have, financial asset bubbles, stock market or luxury real estate going up. And I think that's the situation now. And it's really taken this terrible conjuncture this month of a terrible upsurge of anger and looting on the one hand, and a lot of pressure, I think, from social movements, and more power to them. This is a great society where civil society groups and unions can make the case that this unemployment and inequality and poverty has gotten out of control. The state really has to fix the scales even a little bit.
So this social grant, this social relief distress grant, will expire early next year. And is the bet that by the time that it expires, that somehow the economy will have gotten going? Because if not, we will be in exactly the same position, but we will have run out of money.
Well, you could be right, that we'll be in the same position and that the social anger won't really have been solved. In other words, that we're still going to see upsurges of looting, of anger, of protest, of crime. The societies had a very high level of protest, and what we just saw was very disorganized. There was nobody that was coordinating it properly, not 12 people on social media, as is rumored. I think the real question, as you say, can we find the money? And will the finance minister, Tito Mboweni, come around to a different point of view than he's had, which is he's been very opposed to these social grants. He actually reduced the size of the social grant in this year's budget, keeping it below the inflation rate, especially food inflation rate or electricity inflation rate. So I think that's, again, the question of whether a bloc that's in Treasury and the Reserve Bank, which is very conservative, very sort of far more, we could call it neoliberal, than any really that I know around the world, will still maintain that position? Or will there be continuing unrest, a hot summer? By February, March, the next budget, we'll have to see.
What can we learn from other countries on the continent or in developing nations? Because they don't have so much of this social spending in terms of grants and so on and so forth. And it almost forces citizens, society to make a plan. How do we encourage that innovativeness to make a plan, but also make sure that there's some security at least?
Well, many of the social safety nets of, say, the rest of the African continent rely on something we don't have, which is an effective peasantry, right? People who can grow their own food and send food to the city and have a sort of fallback. South Africa, because of apartheid, has just, and ineffectual land reform, has just not produced that layer that can, bring back from the cities the unemployed. So when this began to become a major problem in the 1980s, you may remember the term IMF riot, when austerity hit, when states shrunk, when economies were down and out. The 80s and 90s were the sort of lost decades for much of Africa. It was really a silent revolution, as the Ethiopian scholar Fantu Chero calls it, in which the society could absorb this sort of angry urban mass who'd been on IMF riots, and food production was one way to keep that society going. And I think around the world we do actually see peer states. I mean, this is in Africa the wealthiest country in absolute terms, not per capita, but it does strike me that we could compare to Thailand, for example, or Brazil. And even Brazil with Bolsonaro had much more generous grants last year. Thailand has done the same. And look, we're in a COVID-19 pandemic, which continues. We may have a fourth wave. We haven't got enough of our society vaccinated. And I think under those circumstances, the state really has to continue simply to say, even if we're at an 80% debt to GDP, the total public debt to GDP is higher than it's been since the 1940s or so. We have had even higher debt to GDP, and we can go further. In fact, in 1928, I think it was our peak at 125%. And the strategy that was used during the pre-apartheid era in 1930s was to go local and have state enterprise to solve the poor white problem. To me, that's one of the strategies that we should be looking at. 1930s, John Maynard Keynes. Unfortunately, some of those old lessons about saving capitalism from its own worst, let's say, internal contradictions through state spending have to be learned again and again.
All right, we've run out of time, but perhaps you can answer this question quite briefly if you can. Given the social pressures, citizen pressures, the political pressures, and the economic pressures that the President and the Finance Minister are facing, do you think that what they've announced today is the best that we could do under the circumstances?
Oh, no, I think if President Ramaphosa really took seriously a theory that from the base there is a powder keg and it's exploded in 2 of the provinces, and it could explode in others, then he would have done much more. And again, the 50 Rand per day basic poverty line, so about 1,500 Rand per person per month, is where I would like to see the basic income grant. To me, that would give people a chance to live in dignity. A rapid installation, very low levels of corruption, because you're really sending money directly to ordinary people, stimulate the economy, especially to buy more goods locally and have more backward and forward linkages. That would have been much preferable. So in a way, we're getting a tokenistic solution. It's consistent with the very low levels of welfare spending. But it does reflect that the society is very angry, and the president is trying to throw, I think, a few crumbs out. Maybe it will work, maybe it won't.
All right, we shall have to wait and see. Professor Patrick Bond, always great talking to you. Insights greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.